What's up, guys? Welcome to another podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about a few different things. We're going to take a break from our normal rankings podcast that we've been doing. We'll get back to it next week with our wide receivers and have another guy from our page on, Blake. He's been with us for quite some time now, so he'll be helping us out with the wide receiver rankings next week. But for today, we got a few different things we're going to go over. Before we get into all the football stuff, I just want to ask you, sports, they're back in full swing, Jordan. Since the last time that we talked, the NBA has started up its regular season portion. The NHL has started up. Have you been watching any of it? How invested have you been?
Oh no, I never watch sports. Yeah, no, so I have a multiple TV setup, and it was kind of cool. For the first time this weekend, I had three different sports on there, so you don't really get to do that very frequently. But
Yeah.
yeah, so I've been watching a little bit of everything, and there's a lot of intensity in the NHL and NBA. I mean, you're really just jumping into playoff hockey slash playoff basketball, so it's really high level. You're not starting with spring training baseball or anything cute like that. You're hopping into it, and these teams they're taking it full force.
Yeah, and I love the way that the NHL and the NBA are doing it. I don't know the exact numbers for the NBA, but in the NHL there was a piece of news on the ticker that said that since they all got into the bubble, which there's one in Toronto and then one in Edmonton, they haven't had one positive case. So they're doing their daily testing, and it's been all healthy players. We're getting full strength rosters aside from the other physical injuries not related to COVID. So it's awesome that we're getting that level of play, at least from the hockey side. Anybody
Yeah, the last
missing
time
from
I
the
saw
NBA?
it, not really anybody major. There's some people that left the bubble and now they're being punished, so they can't play because they like getting chicken wings from strip clubs. But that's a
Who
whole other
doesn't?
topic. I mean, they're the best wings in Georgia, so I mean that has to be fair enough. But yeah, I mean, last time I looked at the numbers, and this is since the beginning of the bubble, only 0.3% of players have tested positive, and that was what right when they came into the bubble too. So it wasn't anything recent. That was a month ago or so. And they entered the bubble mid-July. So yeah, about a month ago now that some of the players tested positive. They did their normal quarantine, and now we're ready to rock and roll. And as long as nobody gets hungry for chicken wings, we should be good to go.
Just got to get them door dashed instead. All right. So we're into August now. As of this recording, we're into August, which means that we're basically a little over a month away from the football season starting. If this were a regular off season without any corona going on, we'd be into the preseason right now. The Hall of Fame game would have already been played. We'd kind of have an idea of what teams are starting to look like. Um, Not really any major cuts. There was Brian Winters, the offensive guard from the Jets, have been cut from the Jets, and now he's just signed with the Bills. So he stays in the division. He has a chance to really start here too. They're still trying to put the offensive line together there and give a solid run game and protect Josh Allen. But other than that, nothing real major as far as cuts coming out recently. But as the weeks go on, obviously teams are going to have to cut down to their 53, or if the league is allowing for any more players, which I haven't heard anything of yet. So probably going to be a 53-man roster. Today we're going to be talking about the coaching carousel. We haven't really done that yet. I know it's late into the off season, but I mean, we could definitely get into the coaching carousel, how these new coaches and offensive and defensive coordinators are gonna go in 2020. I mean, it's a whole new system for everybody without this regular off season, without the preseason, without mini camps in July. You got 5 new head coaches going into new systems, and they're expected to succeed right out of the gate, and some of them might. I mean, one of them is walking into a really high-powered offense and a really great defense, and he's got a Super Bowl under his belt, and he's had a lot of experience in this league. So maybe in the Cowboys case that works out, but I mean these other guys, where how's it going to work out for at least 2020, and what they do in 2020, is that going to affect how long they stay as a head coach beyond? Obviously, most of these coaches are going to get more than 1 year coaching. They're not just going to get fired after 1 year. But should this season really affect how their resume goes because of that? Because they really can't have all that chemistry built right away. Next, and then after that, we're going to get into some fantasy terminology, just some abbreviations and words that you might hear thrown around and you don't exactly know what they mean. So we're just going to kind of go over them for you, give you some examples, and kind of help you out in that department. I mean, you know what your draft is, you know what ADP is, but we're going to talk about some of that stuff. We're going to talk about some bets that we have internally in our Fantasy Mafia group chat. None of them are real big money bets. It's not the kind of bets we're doing. They're all more for like pride, but it's a few 5, 10, $20 bets here and there. So we're going to talk about those, and then we'll close it out with some high profile and offensive players that have opted out so far. And the deadline for that is Thursday, was that the 4th?
Yeah, yep, it's whatever this Thursday is. I believe that's no, today's the 3rd, so that would be the 5th?
Thursday the 5th, and then, well, that would be the 6th. Well, whatever.
6th, whatever.
But, well, by the time this podcast posts, it'll be that day because these post on Thursday. So that's the deadline day for opt outs. And yeah, let's just jump into it. Let's get right into the coaching carousel. I'll just mention the 5 new head coaches, and we'll kind of just break them down one by one. So the Panthers bring in Matt Rule. The Browns bring in Kevin Stefanski. The Cowboys, like I kind of mentioned in the preview, bring in Mike McCarthy. The Giants bring in Joe Judge. And the Washington football team bring in Ron Rivera. So let's start with the Panthers here. I didn't mention their OC or DC, and then you got a couple other new OCs and DCs that you might want to bring up. But let's start with the Panthers here.
Yeah, so first of all, I am very disappointed there's no preseason because now we can't overhype guys that'll be irrelevant during the regular season. I mean, I always love those late round draft darts like Jacoby Myers. I mean, what am I going to do without Jacoby Myers in my redraft league? So I'm a little disappointed by that, but I guess I'll lose a few nights of sleep and move on. But we'll start off with the Panthers here. And yeah, you mentioned Matt Rule coming from the college ranks. He brings Joe Brady from LSU with him. And I would say of all the coaching changes, this is the most intriguing one.
Yeah.
We've seen from all these other coaching, even Stefanski and Joe Judge, they're rookie head coaches, but we've kind of seen what they can do in the NFL. Joe Judge is probably, I mean, he's a little bit of a question mark too, but we'll talk about that later. But, I mean, this is the most intriguing and I think the most exciting pairing here. Just kind of a quick background on Joe Brady's offense. The best comparison that you can give for it is to Sean Payton's offense in New Orleans. I don't know why I said it like that. New Orleans. And he did work there briefly in the NFL before he went back to the college ranks. But that's really the best way. It's a lot of short throws. When you think of Drew Brees, you don't think of, a big, powerful arm. A lot of it's focused on short dink and dunk throws, high-powered, high-fast-paced offense. So, one of the things you and I have talked about pretty extensively is how this impacts DJ Moore. And I actually saw an interview with Joe Brady once, and somebody said, how do you describe your offensive system? And he said, I like to get my playmakers in space. And I mean, number one, if that's not Christian McCaffrey, then I don't know what is. I mean, that is literally an offense made for him to a T. So Christian McCaffrey is already a star. I've said before, I mean, I think it's actually possible that McCaffrey could have an even better season. And I think that sounds bizarre because he had 2,400 yards last season, and how can you possibly go up from that? But I really think in an offense that's even more focused on his success, he could see an increase realistically. And then going to DJ Moore, I think it has a big impact on him. And kind of an interesting stat that I found about DJ Moore is he broke a tackle last season on 40% of his receptions. That's significant, and people a lot of times see him as a possession wide receiver, but they really don't realize how much of a yard after catch monster he is. So I think that this offense is going to be tailored towards Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore. When Joe Brady says, I want to get my playmakers in space, those are their two playmakers, and I'm not going to argue with anybody about Robbie Anderson, because if you think Robbie Anderson's taking targets away from DJ Moore, then we don't have anything else to discuss because that's a ridiculous. Robbie Anderson is what he is. He's a guy that stretches the field, and there's nothing wrong with it. That's why he was brought in here. You have Samuel and DJ Moore who run more short to intermediate routes, and then you have Robbie Anderson to stretch the field. And yeah, Robbie Anderson's shown some potential with the Jets, but I've never seen anything that indicated to me that he's a number one wide receiver. I mean, that's a reality. I'd say at his best and his peak, he's Deshaun Jackson and that kind of mold. And even Deshaun Jackson, do we really consider Deshaun Jackson an alpha number one wide receiver? I don't. I mean, I personally don't. To me, he's always been not a gadget player, but a guy that he stretches the field to use him on play action passes, to get you 30, 40-yard gainers. So I think that's what Robbie Anderson is. He's not going to be taking away those short targets from DJ Moore. As I mentioned, this is what this offense is. When you look at the Saints offense, and like I said, that's really the best comparison that I can give you for it. Pretty consistently, the Saints offense is one of the lowest in total air yards. So essentially, all that means is they're shorter routes. So, I mean, that really favors guys like Curtis Samuel and even more so DJ Moore. I could see them running quite a few screens with DJ Moore, and I could see him getting huge chunk plays off of that. So I love DJ Moore this season, and I'm excited to see how this offense is implemented into the NFL. Obviously, Joe Brady's really young. This is going to be his first go at it as a offensive coordinator in the NFL. Matt Rule hasn't got the opportunity to lead an entire organization. So there's a lot of question marks here, but I'm really excited to see it. I mean, Joe Brady, you don't get to be an offensive coordinator. And how old is he? He's in his early 30s, I think. He's a young guy. So, I mean, they wouldn't just hand over the reins to him if they weren't confident that he could do some damage.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for calling early 30s a young guy because now it makes me feel a little bit better. Yeah, I mean, if there's one other name in all five of these teams, plus a couple of the other teams with the new offensive coordinators and existing coaches, we've already talked about them up to this point in our individual fantasy pods. So you're gonna hear some repetitive stuff. I mean, and for the most part, the fantasy relevant players that we've talked about from these teams, you'll hear some stuff again. But another name that I want to bring up without bashing Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore's name over and over again is Ian Thomas. He's another guy that I think could be semi-successful in this offense with the way that Joe Brady and Matt Rule want to run it. He's going to be their safety blanket over the middle, the short yardage passes, if it's not a screen to Moore or a slant to Moore or out of the backfield to McCaffrey. So that's another target that I want to put in this offense for him. The only thing that like you could really argue against, and anybody could argue against, is can Teddy Bridgewater support three pass catching options? Because when we're also looking at, you already mentioned his name, Robbie Anderson, but he's not going to be a huge threat. And then Curtis Samuel was a name that we haven't even brought up. So, but between DJ Moore, Christian McCaffrey, and Ian Thomas, can Teddy Bridgewater and his sub 250 yard passing games and maybe 2 touchdowns a game support those three guys? That's where it gets tough. And he's not really a huge scrambler either, Teddy, and he has that knee injury from a couple of years ago, which probably makes him even less of a scrambler. So if you're looking for like a deeper sleeper tight end, Ian Thomas is the guy, but your top two guys are McCaffrey and Moore, and then that's pretty much it. I just wanted to throw Ian Thomas out there.
Joe Brady is 30 years old, by the way.
Oh, he's younger than me, damn it. What am I doing with my life? I'm talking about Joe Brady.
You're not calling plays for the Panthers yet.
Not yet. But they're going to hire somebody younger than me. Well, they already have, but they're going to hire somebody else younger than me. Moving on to the Browns. When we talked about them in the mini-series, we mentioned probably numerous times that they had a subpar season last year. I don't know if you went into the season thinking that they were actually going to turn it around, but I thought they were going to turn it around going out and acquiring Odell. Baker Mayfield going into his second year, coming off a 27 touchdown rookie season, which broke the record for a rookie, and they kind of just stunk the bed last year. Now they got a new head coach, Kevin Stefanski. They bring in Alex Van Pelt as the offensive coordinator, former quarterback in this league. What are your thoughts on how the coaching tree is there?
Yeah, and if you've heard me or Jerry on any episode talking about any Browns player, you probably want to strangle me by now talking about this offense because I think it's extremely relevant for fantasy players this year. And the reality is, I mean, we don't, well, first of all, I guess when you think about the Browns, you don't really think of any fantasy relevance. But, I mean, this offense is going to be run heavy. I mean, Kevin Stefanski coming over from Minnesota, we saw that they had the third fewest pass attempts last year. This is, he learned this offense from Gary Kubiak, and once again, I expect this to be a run-heavy offense. I think Nick Chubb's going to be huge this year. There's already some talk. Jarvis Landry is probably going to be on the pup list to start the year. Not sure if he's going to miss any time, but if that happens, I actually think it helps Nick Chubb's value immensely because I think you could see Kareem Hunt start in the slot instead of take away those running back touches. So I think that could open up Nick Chubb quite a bit. But this is going to be a very run-heavy team, even though Nick Chubb's not going to be as involved in the pass game if him and Hunt are splitting the backfield touches. I do think that he'll make up for it with more rushing attempts, and we saw that with him and Hunt at the end of last year, and I think that trend's only going to continue with a scheme that's more run heavy and more run oriented. I think it's a little interesting. Stefanski was calling the plays in Minnesota last season, but he said already that he was going to give Alex Van Pelt the opportunity to call plays early in the year. I know originally when I read this, he said that he was going to give him a chance to call plays in the preseason. That's not a thing.
So far, so good.
I'd say he's acing that test, but we'll see. If Stefanski trusts Van Pelt enough to call the plays in the beginning of the year. When I looked at Van Pelt's history, he only got to call the plays 1 year in Buffalo before he was fired. Their offense was horrendous that year. I think it was 2009. They were like last in every category, but their rushing attempts were they were okay. I think they were like 20th in rushing attempts, but I mean they were legitimately like 30th in passing yards, 30th in rushing yards. So that offense didn't have a ton of success, but it did tend to be a little more run heavy. So, just everything points to this offense being more run heavy. And what that means is Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt are going to eat. What that means to me is that Odell and Landry, of course, they're going to get their points, but I'm not overdrafting them. The reality is you need volume and opportunity in fantasy. And if this isn't a high volume offense in terms of passing, I don't really trust it. And I've said this before with the Vikings in that offense with Gary Kubiak. You haven't seen Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs produce at the same time. It's been very streaky. Either Thielen's injured, Diggs is out. Very few times has that offense supported two fantasy relevant wide receivers. And don't get me wrong, I think that there's going to be a ton of targets going to Odell and Jarvis Landry, but Odell's being drafted as a back-end wide receiver one, and I think it's going to be really hard to return that value. Not to mention, the last point I'll bring up is they did bring in a guy, I don't know, Austin Hooper or something, so they're paying him a few dollars, so he's going to be involved in that offense as well. They're going to run two tight end sets. David Njoku did ask for a trade, but he since rescinded that, saying he talked to management and everything's good and fine and dandy. So I expect lots of two tight end sets, and I'm not overly high on Beckham. I would pick Landry of the two because he's going much later and he offers a lot more value, especially in PPR leagues. I mean, he's going to have 80 receptions. And it's not fair to me to talk about Landry missing any games because he's never missed a game in his career. But, I mean, the fact is he is going on, it looks like, on the PUP list early this season. So run heavy, and I'm not overly high on any of their pass catchers.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the tight end, Austin Hooper. And if you want to talk about somebody that I think is being overdrafted, I think Austin Hooper is definitely being overdrafted. His name alone is giving him a higher price tag than what he should be. Yeah, he's going to be on the field a lot because that's the way that Stefanski ran the offense in Minnesota with having the two tight ends with Irv Smith and Kyle Rudolph. But there's just it's going to be more run heavy, like he said. He's going to get some catches, he's going to get some yards, he's going to get some touchdowns, but it's not going to be where he's not going to get the same kind of volume that he saw in Atlanta with Matt Ryan and having that terrible defense there where they needed to throw it all the time. And that's another thing that we didn't even bring up, but the Cleveland Browns defense isn't bad at all. They've definitely improved over the past couple of years. Their back end, their corners and safeties, their secondary is it's a lot of young, higher price guys, first, second, third round talent. So they're trying to build to be able to stop the air attack. They could get to the quarterback. They got one of the best young defensive ends in the league, who just got paid a nice chunk of money not too long ago, or he's looking to get paid. But did he get paid yet, Garrett?
Yeah, yeah, he just got his big contract. Yep.
I don't know if they were talking about it or if he actually got it,
Yep.
but
Yeah, it's finalized. Yep.
so I mean their defense is good. They're not going to be passing a lot because of the way that the OC and head coach are set up, and also they're not going to be passing a lot because they're probably not going to need to pass a lot because of the defense. So good analysis of them. I mean, invested in their running backs. I think Baker's going to have a better year than last year, but I don't know if he's going to get close to 27, 30 touchdowns, maybe closer to like 24. Hopefully he's safer with the football.
Kirk
Maybe like
Cousins season.
yeah, he's not going to need to sling it. So he's a good second quarterback in a super flex league. Next up, we're going to go to the Dallas Cowboys. They brought in Mike McCarthy. He's got a Super Bowl under his belt. They retained Kellen Moore, so he's still going to call the plays there in Dallas. This offense, when we talked about them on their mini pod, we absolutely love this offense. There's so much that we could talk about. If you want to listen to the whole thing, just go listen to the Fantasy Preview Dallas Cowboys show that we did. But let's talk about the coaches here. What's your thoughts on McCarthy and Kellen Moore here?
Yeah, I could argue that this one is actually the least exciting because I don't think much is going to change. The one thing I will bring up with Mike McCarthy, a lot of people probably don't remember, but at the end of his tenure in Green Bay, his play calling actually came into question quite a bit. And I only remember this because I have some Packers friends, and I think the only thing they complained about every single week was how Mike McCarthy needed to give up the play calling duties. So I think it's kind of interesting that he let Kellen Moore keep those duties. And even though he's there, if you say, okay, he's been a former play caller, he's going to be in Kellen Moore's ear to some extent, whether it's game planning. During the game, probably not as much, maybe halftime adjustments, but realistically, it's going to be more in the game planning phase of calling the plays. So, but even when you look at it, Mike McCarthy's offense is kind of similar to how Kellen Moore called plays last year. And I mentioned this in our mini series, but Kellen Moore and the Cowboys last year, they averaged the 13th most pass yards per game as a team. I went back through Mike McCarthy's career and I averaged it for him. And what do you know? Also averaged the 13th most. So it's kind of crazy how it's exact in that manner. And same with the rushing attempts. It was very similar. It's a very balanced offense. I think you're going to continue to see a very balanced offense. And, you know, it might seem crazy to say, but I don't expect a lot to change here. I think Dak has another big season. You know, he had a ton of pass attempts last year, but even if that comes down a little bit, there's plenty to go around for Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, CeeDee Lamb, Blake Jarwin, Zeke out of the backfield. There's a lot of big names there, but there's more than enough opportunity for them. So I like this offense. It's a really high-powered offense, and they'll be top 10 in the league in points scored and yards gained. I'm pretty confident in saying that.
Yeah, with Kellen Moore staying there, like you said, there's not going to be much that changes. They lose Jason Witten, they lose Randall Cobb, but they bring in CeeDee Lamb in the draft, and Blake Jarwin kind of gets a bump up. We've seen what Tony Pollard can do when given the ball, so he might actually be on the field a little bit more. Obviously, he's a huge target if Zeke were to go down for any sort of reason, but even with Zeke healthy, Pollard is a third, fourth flex guy if you're in those super deep leagues like that. I really couldn't say that I really couldn't pinpoint a week where he'd start, but unless it's a blowout potential game and you got like a second flex spot, you could put Pollard in there. But yeah, there's not really much that's going to change as far as this offense goes, and it doesn't really need to. I mean, Dak had close to 5,000 yards passing last year. It's from a fantasy perspective, it's hard to pinpoint like which wide receiver you would want to draft, but you're definitely looking at taking Dak, you're definitely looking at taking Zeke, and you're going to be satisfied with the results at the end of the year. Moving on to the Giants, we got Joe Judge. I personally don't know much about him. I don't know where he came from. So hopefully you can clear all that up for me. But they bring in Jason Garrett. He stays in the division. He's going to be the offensive coordinator. He gets to see the Cowboys twice a year. We get to see all his clapping. So why don't you learn me a little bit on Joe Judge here?
So Joe Judge is probably the most questionable hiring decision of this entire offseason. And I think a lot of people were surprised because Eric Bieniemy, who is the offensive coordinator in Kansas City, has been very highly regarded for a few years now, and he just can't get a head coaching opportunity. So I really thought the Giants were going to go in that direction. That's a guy that's worked under Andy Reid for a few years, who's had a lot of success and has had coaches go on and have success as well. But Joe Judge has been with the Patriots since 2012, and he's been their special teams coordinator. So it's a little bit of a jump there. He split duties a little bit as their wide receivers coach. So I don't expect him to be heavily involved in the play calling. That's pretty much going to fall on Jason Garrett. To me, this is more of just a culture hire. I'm expecting them to want Joe Judge to come in there and bring a Bill Belichick kind of culture to the Giants. I think that's what he's there for. That's the only reason you hire a special teams coordinator, is to be the leader of the organization. It's not for his expertise in special teams play calling. That's just not normally how it works. So from what I've read, and Bill Belichick has said this publicly, that he's the most hard-nosed assistant coach that's ever worked for him. So I expect him to go in there and bring a no-nonsense, almost kind of like Tom Coughlin, I guess, when he was with the Giants. He had a very no-nonsense kind of approach to things. So I think that's what you can expect from Joe Judge. In terms of this offense, we've seen what Jason Garrett's done before. A lot of his play calling decisions have been very questionable, but the reality is Zeke was very successful in this offense. Saquon's going to be fine. They're going to revolve this entire scheme around Saquon. He's their best player. He's their best playmaker. This should be a very balanced offense overall, and I don't think it'll have much impact in general. I'm interested to see what Joe Judge does on the whole, just because I know when he got hired, people were like, I have no idea who that guy is. And heading into the season, nobody still knows who this guy is. So he's got a lot to prove. I thought the Jason Garrett decision was interesting, just because I think a lot of people thought he was going to bring in a much stronger coordinator. I mean, Jason Garrett's just getting off a very horrendous tenure with the Cowboys where he has a poor reputation. So I was a little surprised they went in that direction. But Jason Garrett is a former quarterback in this league. So if anything, we have seen Dak improve and seen Dak provide more for fantasy owners over the past few years. So if he can bring a little bit of that experience to Daniel Jones, I think that'll be helpful for Jones's development. But overall, I don't think it really is a big plus or minus for fantasy purposes for the Giants' offensive weapons.
Yeah, it's going to be an experience for sure. Obviously, you're taking Saquon Barkley at second overall, regardless of who's the head coach and offensive coordinator. Their wide receivers, you got a trio of them there that are pretty much all low end wide receiver two, high end wide receiver threes, flex plays. I mean, Jason Garrett, when he wasn't really calling all the plays in Dallas, but if it's anything like play calling in Dallas, they did like the tight end, so Evan Ingram could get a boost here. They love Jason Witten there for the years that he was there, long time. So it's it's going to be fun. It's going to be interesting to see, and we'll see how it works out, I guess. Like I said, I don't know much about Joe Judge, but I've seen Jason Garrett for the past however long he was in Dallas, 10, 11 years, and it's nice to see him going to be wearing a different polo this time. And then
Cowboys fans agree.
Yeah. Giants fans are gonna hate Cowboys fans even more. Why'd you send us this guy? The final team that we got here is called the football team. And so three teams from the NFC East actually changed their coaches this year. Doug Peterson is the lone wolf in that division that's staying the same. They bring in a really good coach, actually, Ron Rivera. He's been to the Super Bowl. Scott Turner is our offensive coordinator. They this is going to be real interesting too. It's they got a high draft pick in Dwayne Haskins, but he's not really tied to Ron Rivera at all. They went out and specifically traded for Kyle Allen. I mean, it's not like saying that there wasn't really a lot of other options to choose from. I mean, Cam Newton was also available too. I guess they could have brought him in, and he knows Ron Rivera as well. But it's not like Kyle Allen was a free agent and he went out and signed him for backup insurance. They specifically traded for him. And then news came out just last week that Alex Smith is cleared to practice. So whether or not he's ready for 2020, that remains to be seen. Kyle Allen has been in Ron Rivera's system for the last 2 years. He didn't play much 2 years ago, but last year I played a nice handful of games, and he wasn't great by any means, but at least Ron Rivera knows him. And like I said, Haskins really isn't tied directly to Ron Rivera. We saw it with the Arizona Cardinals, where they go out and draft Josh Rosen in the top 10, and then the very next year they bring in Cliff Kingsbury and they draft Kyler Murray. So Ron Rivera isn't married to Haskins, but it's going to be interesting to see what they do from the quarterback position. But yeah, what are your thoughts on Ron Rivera and this hiring here?
So Ron Rivera, I mean, I talked about this with Joe Judge. I mean, you want to talk about a guy that needs to come in and change the culture like 10 years ago. I mean, that's the Washington football team. And Ron Rivera, I think, is the right guy for the job. I mean, when you think about the Panthers and a hard-nosed guy who the players really respected, I mean, that's Ron Rivera. So I really like that hire. Ron Rivera is a great defensive mind, and I think that's going to help their defense out tremendously. And we've talked about this before, but they have a very young front seven, and I think Ron Rivera is going to help that out tremendously. And I would expect to see that defense make huge strides this season. So, for offensive weapon wise, Scott Turner is more relevant. And he comes over from Carolina with Ron Rivera. He only got to call the plays last season, but we saw an offense that was very run heavy or pass heavy. Sorry, they were actually second in the league in pass attempts. When you look at his dad, Norv Turner, historically, they ran more of a West Coast scheme, which was very pass heavy and oriented on very oriented on throwing short passes. But I think that you're going to see the same thing here in the beginning. I think they're going to be very pass heavy. And that's really the scheme that Scott Turner runs. So I expect Haskins to have a ton of attempts, and it makes sense to me too because I think that they're going to need to see what they have in Haskins. But it's kind of a conflict of interest to me because you think of Ron Rivera as a very hard-nosed, old-school head coach who wants to pound the football, but then he brings in an offensive coordinator who's very pass heavy. And when you think of the Panthers, I don't think you think of pass heavy, but that's a reality. This team had the second most pass attempts. So coming into Washington, I think there's a lot of question marks around this offense. And, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Is it more of the hard-nosed scheme that we think of Ron Rivera 10 years ago, or is it a very pass-heavy spread offense that Scott Turner tried to implement in Carolina last season? So a lot of question marks there. This is a very strong offensive line, which will help all of their offensive weapons there. And a lot of it, I think, is just a wait and see game with this offense. I'm not heavily investing into this offense. I mean, realistically, a lot of them are going as late round dart throws, but I think the way to really sum up this offense is a lot of question marks. Even with looking at Scott Turner's 1 year as calling play as a play caller with the Panthers, I don't think that's enough data to suggest that he is going to be calling plays one way or another. His dad did say at one point that they call plays very differently, so you can't even say, oh, his dad calls plays a West Coast style. It doesn't really matter because Scott Turner is going to be his own offensive coordinator, and just like the offensive weapons, a lot of question marks on the coaching staff here. So I, once again, don't think it's going to have a huge impact. but I am interested to see, and I think the big question and development this year will be what do they do with Dwayne Haskins? And I think it'd be very interesting if Haskins goes out and has a huge season. I think nobody's counting on Haskins being any good. So if he comes out and just balls out, it's a huge question mark. If this defense is good, Haskins balls out. Let's say they go 8-8 this year, kind of surprisingly. What do they do then? I mean, they're in a situation. Do they stick with Haskins? They try to trade up for somebody. So there's a lot of question marks here.
Yeah, definitely a lot of question marks. The offense that we know is not probably not going to be really good. They, I mean, Scary Terry himself is a guy that I really haven't been targeting and haven't seen him fall to a spot that I'd like to grab him in just because I don't trust the quarterback situation here. Now I haven't really done a mock since they announced that Alex Smith was able to practice. And again, I mean, we're a little bit over a month away from the season, and we don't know how if he's even going to play. But and I'll talk about it a little bit later when we get to our bets that we got going on. I'll just talk about it now. I have a bet with one of the guys in our group that I'm betting that Haskins isn't the day one starter. And until we know who the day one starter is, it's really like there's just so many question marks on this team. Um, it's a small bet. I said $5. I'll take the field. You take Haskins. It's a guy that's really high on Haskins in our group. So I just said I'll take Alex Smith and I'll take Kyle Allen. And Haskins I think has the edge. He's obviously the higher pick. He was the end of the year starter last year. Started to show some chemistry with Terry McLaurin. But I don't know. I mean, new coach coming in, not a regular off season, so we don't know what we're going to see in camp. Obviously, these guys aren't just going right from the Super Bowl last year into playing Week 1 this year without any kind of practice. So there's still going to be a camp. It's not open to the public, but they're still gonna practice. They're still going to have those three quarterbacks on the field throwing footballs to the wide receivers and going over some offensive plays. So any one of those three guys could really win the job. Alex Smith, obviously, he's got to be fully healthy, but it's going to be interesting. Definitely going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think just from an organizational standpoint, they're silly to not give Dwayne Haskins an opportunity. I talked about Kyle Allen previously, but I mean, he's not that good. I mean, that's the reality is people think he's going to step in and start from day one. If Alex Smith is 100% healthy, that's a different story. I'm a little intrigued by that. I'm not going to lie, because like I said, I like their defense a lot. I think Ron Rivera can turn that defense around. So is it realistic for them to have a top 10 defense and Alex Smith and comes in and kind of like Tyrod with the Chargers right now. Can Alex Smith step in, manage this offense to maybe a borderline playoff team? Maybe, and he probably has a better chance than Dwayne Haskins. But at this point, Dwayne Haskins is really young. He came out as a junior. A lot of people thought he was going to stay longer because he really didn't start that many games in college, and he only had the one big season at Ohio State. So they're silly though. They invested the draft capital in him. This is a rebuilding team. Even if they snuck into the playoffs, they would get demolished in the first round, and I think that's a pipe dream anyways. So they really need to just focus on developing their young guys, and this needs to be a season to say, hey, is Haskins our guy or is he not? And if they can't answer that question at the end of the season, I think it's a failed season.
Yep. All right, and then the last thing, couple new offensive coordinators with the same coaches on their teams. Chan Gailey is now in Miami with the Dolphins. Jay Gruden is also down in Florida with the Jaguars, and then Pat Shermer goes to the Broncos. So let's I don't want to spend too much time on it. I know you got a lot of things to say about Chan Gailey. You absolutely love the way that he calls his plays and runs his offense. But give us a little bit of thoughts about each of these guys, and then we'll move on to the next subject here.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to sum it up quickly, all three of these guys run very pass-heavy schemes. I mean, that's the bottom line for all three of these guys. So Chan Gailey, I think, has a ton of fantasy relevance for owners. And even you can speak to this. A few months ago, I did not like Devontae Parker at all. But when I really started to dive into Chan Gailey's offense, it really revolves around a strong X receiver, which is what Devontae Parker is. And I mentioned it before, but Stevie Johnson had 1,000-yard seasons, and everywhere that Chan Gailey's gone, Eric Decker and Brandon Marshall with the Jets, everywhere that he's gone, there's been 1,000-yard receiver who's been a borderline wide receiver one. And there's no reason, in my opinion, that Devontae Parker can't do that with him. I don't care if it's Tua. I don't care if it's Ryan Fitzpatrick. I think this is an offense that you could see sling the ball around everywhere, and I think there's going to be a lot of success for Parker, Mike Gesicki, and I have a lot of faith and upside for that offense. Same thing with Jay Gruden. Kirk Cousins, when you look at his best fantasy seasons, they've all come with Jay Gruden as the offensive coordinator. I've mentioned before, but I think the Jags defense is going to be absolutely terrible, so that only helps. They're going to have to be pass heavy, helps Minshew mania there in Jacksonville. So once again, I think I'm targeting Minshew as a late round upside QB because of that offense and because of the overall situation. And then same thing with Pat Shurmur. Shurmur comes over from a pretty rough tenure with the Giants as their head coach. But over the course of his career, he's been in this league for a long time. He is known for a guy that works with young QBs. And I think that's why they brought him in to work with Drew Lock. And we've seen Shurmur have success with young guys previously. Even Daniel Jones. I think Daniel Jones and how good he looked last season surprised a lot of people. I know people were really upset with that pick. And already after year one, you're saying, okay, I can kind of see it now. He looks like a guy that can be a quality starting quarterback in this league. And so I think Pat Shurmur comes in. That's going to help Drew Lock out a lot. Pat Shurmur, over the course of his career, his offensives have almost always been in the top 10 in pass attempts. So that's kind of interesting. And Drew Lock, you could see, have a huge season this year. If they're top 10 in pass attempts with all those weapons, Drew Lock could have a monster year.
All right. The only one thing that I want to just touch on is going back to Chan Gailey with the Dolphins. Obviously, it doesn't really matter who starts there, Tua or Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick has the upper hand, but Fitzpatrick's also at the point in his career where he's been a slinger his whole career, but he's at the point of his career where if he goes out there and he just turns the ball over, he puts up 450 yards, a couple touchdowns, but turns the ball over a lot, and he gets benched. He doesn't care. He's just playing football just to get out of the house right now. Yeah, I mean, your analysis over the past couple times that we've talked about the Jaguars and specifically Gardner Minshew is kind of swaying me towards liking Gardner Minshew a little bit more. So you're definitely moving him up in my rankings. Get out of my head, and then and then Pat Shurmur with the Broncos. Yeah, I mean all the weapons there. It's another one of those situations, just kind of like Dallas, where you probably want to get your hands on the quarterback if you can, but it's tough to determine which wide receiver you want, which pass catcher that you want in that offense. But they're gonna be a fun team to watch, and especially in those KC games. Do you want to have a shootout with Kansas City? Absolutely not. They'll destroy you, but it could be. Those are going to be some fun games to watch. The next segment that we wanted to talk about was fantasy terminology. Um, just just a whole bunch of different abbreviations and words that you might hear that you're not exactly sure exactly what they mean. Some of them are kind of self-explanatory. We don't have every single terminology word on here, but just some of the major big ones that we just want to kind of go over with you a little bit and kind of hopefully clear things up. And yeah, so let's get right into it. The biggest one, and these are alphabetical too, so it's a good thing that this is number one because this is probably the most important one, is ADP, and that stands for average draft position. And that varies throughout the industry based on people doing different mocks. You're looking at you're doing a specific mock draft and you see, okay, Odell is going at 112 right now, and so that's his average draft position. And then the next time you go do a mock a month later, Odell's going at 27 because he's been getting drafted later in mocks between that time. So anything that you can really say about ADP and why it's important to fantasy?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really important when you're trying to strategize where you draft guys. I think that's the most important piece to take out of this. I always think that people should do their own rankings and have in their head, okay, I have Miles Sanders at 6, but his ADP is 10 right now. Because I guess I'm different than some people. I don't like reaching on players, even if that's quote unquote my guy. I mean, I don't like reaching on them. That's a reality. I think that you need to find value. That's what drafting. I've always said it's all about value and upside, and ADP and knowing someone's ADP is a part of that. So if I really like Miles Sanders and I would take him with the 6th overall pick, but typically he's going with the 3rd pick in the 2nd round, I'm not going to reach on him because I know where he's going and I can strategize going in. Okay, I can take him here, I can't take him here, and based on that strategy, you can kind of formulate who you're taking at what position. So I think it's important to kind of find where you have someone versus where they're being drafted, and you plan your strategy around that.
All right, and I'll use Miles Sanders for our next term or our next term here, just
Ooh.
as an example. Not that I don't think he's one
Oh
of these,
no,
but
right.
so the next one is bust, and that's a player who doesn't perform to his ADP. So, for example, if for some reason Miles Sanders his ADP ends up going up to being 6th overall, and everybody's drafting him at 6th, and then he ends up being RB 13. That would be considered a bust. He's not performing up to expectations. A player like, who would it be? We'll use Odell again. Odell last year, being drafted as a wide receiver 1 and finishing outside. Baker Mayfield is probably a perfect example of that. Baker Mayfield was drafted. He went into the season with all this hype. He was drafted as a wide receiver or a quarterback 1. If he was drafted as a wide receiver 1, he definitely finished as a bust.
Oh, he stinks.
Drafted as a quarterback 1, and he definitely did not live up to expectations. So it's a guy that you basically take high, or it's a guy that you take at a certain draft position that doesn't finish where he should finish. Any reiterations on that, or explain it a little bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this discussion, well, we have a few times in our chat. I mean, there's not an exact definition. I mean, I think the just broadly to put it, it's somebody that doesn't live up to expectations, but what does that exactly mean? If you take a running back and he's the 6th running back off the board and he finishes as a 7th, I mean, technically he didn't live up to expectations, but is that really a bust?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people think of it in more extreme terms, like, oh, I took him as a 6th running back and he finished 24th. Or maybe you think of it more in tiers. If you think he's an RB1, but he finishes as an RB3, that's obviously terrible value there. But I think overall, when you're drafting, the goal is to find guys where you can maximize their value. And it kind of segues into the next term you have here as well. I'm not a fan of taking guys at their ceiling, and that, they all kind of flow together. But I say this quite a bit. I don't like drafting players at their ceiling. So, for example, if I think Julian Edelman, the best that he can do, best case scenario, is he's the 15th wide receiver off the board. I don't want to take him as the 15th wide receiver off the board because he's not providing you any value. That's his peak performance is 15th. I'm looking at it, okay, I want to take him as the 30th wide receiver off the board because then there's 15 spots there where he has value and provides value for your team.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way that I think of drafting, is just maximizing that value. In the early rounds, obviously that's hard to do. If you have the 1st overall pick, there's no way to maximize that draft position. I mean, if you take McCaffrey number 1 and he's the number 1 guy, I mean, I think in the early rounds it's all about just returning value. But as you get later into a draft, it's more about capitalizing on that value and making sure you're not taking a guy at a ceiling and you find value.
Yeah, and then I mean another, like, you explained it perfectly. Another way that you could look at ceiling too is trying to project like how much a player is going to score each week too. So somebody like Michael Thomas might have a ceiling of 20 points or something like that. So you're basically kind of expecting 20 points from him. It actually more goes into the next term, which is floor, which will use Michael Thomas again, and his floor, say, is 15 points. So you're pretty much guaranteed, or you're thinking that you're guaranteed 15 points from that specific player. Lamar Jackson has a nice floor because he offers that rushing stability. You're probably going to get 60 yards and maybe half a touchdown from him every single week. So that's where the floor comes in. Anything you want to add on to floor and maybe more of the other definition of ceiling?
Yeah, I mean, so you kind of hit on a point, and I'm trying to think in my head how statistical to get here. I mean, I've taken some pretty in-depth statistics courses, but so there's a measure, and essentially it's called fantasy volatility. And without getting too far into it, it essentially measures exactly what you were just talking about. On a normal week, how consistent is a player? Are they consistently at their floor, at their ceiling? Are they kind of all over the place? So yeah, I mean, I think that's really relevant in terms of if you're looking for a consistent player week to week throughout the season. You know, that's critical. A guy like Michael Thomas, I mean, he is pretty consistent week in and week out. Does he have big boom games? Of course, but on average, that guy's a wide receiver one every single week. And I mean, I guess I'll just mention on a side note, if you ever want to have a discussion on analytics specifically, you can always message me, or you can uh, drop a comment in the hotspot, and I'm more than willing to have a conversation with you. But there's lots of cool metrics that you can dive into.
Yeah, I guess I mean Michael Thomas really was a bad example for ceiling because he really doesn't. There really isn't a ceiling for those top tier players. The top tier players are more of the floor. The lower level guys are more the ceiling. Like, okay, I can probably get. I'm looking at Devontae Parker going up against the worst passing defense in the league. He's got a high ceiling this week, but he
Mhm.
might not have a high floor because or a low
Yep.
floor because other factors. Next is one of my favorite ones. It's free agent acquisition budget, otherwise known as FAB. You might see it as. It's basically a specific dollar amount that you're given to acquire waiver wire free agents throughout the season. Some leagues, like dynasty leagues, you might have it for the whole entire calendar year over the off season through the regular season, stuff like that. Other leagues, redraft leagues, you might have it as just obviously during the season. Um, Typically, I mean, there's really no like set dollar amount that it is. It's because we'll get into it a little bit more, but when you're actually doing budgets like that, you're not saying, okay, how much is this guy worth, and it's not a dollar amount that you're usually answering with. You're usually answering with a percentage. So if you have $100, your $100 budget, and Breida goes down and McKinnon is on the free agent waiver wire, and somebody says, "Hey, I have my whole budget. How much is he worth?" An answer that you might get is 40% and not $40. So it always goes by percentage, but I think it's the only way to do waivers correctly. It definitely eliminates some of those leagues where there isn't any kind of waivers at all and it's just a free for all. So if somebody's working on a Sunday and a
Yeah.
guy goes down, you could just go and pick somebody up because you're just sitting on the couch eating Cheetos and drinking Mountain Dew watching football. Another
Hey.
sorry, did I just dip into your Sunday? Another thing it eliminates is just the same guy or same couple of guys getting the top waiver every week because it goes into the worst record every week or something like that. So this gives everybody an equal chance to get waiver wire players, just based on how much they're willing to spend on a specific player.
Yeah, and for me, the best way to do it is fab with the tiebreaker being the standings.
Yep.
So if you both bid the same amount, then the lower, if you're in last place, you get that player because your team stinks. And Jerry knows that rule well. But
Just
yeah.
spend my whole budget
Uh,
on one player.
but yeah, I mean, for me, even going a little beyond that, the reason that I really like it is I think when you're a fantasy junkie, you're just looking for any way to add extra strategy to the game. And that's for me why I really like it, is because it's not only like, okay, I need to spend 40% of my budget. I think you kind of have to understand your league mates a little bit and what their budgets are and what they're looking at, what their needs are. If you're the only person in the league looking for a running back, which is never the case, but you could maybe strategically bid a little lower and save your budget for later. So it just adds a whole nother level of strategy, and that's the reason why I particularly enjoy. If it's just reverse standings or rolling waiver order, I mean, there's some strategy. I know I'm still in plenty of leagues with a rolling waiver order. I'm very strategic because I hold on onto that waiver priority like it's gold, and I wait for the perfect player to pick up, and then usually, because that can be a league-winning decision depending on who you pick up, and same thing depending on who you're bidding on in fab leagues. But yeah, I mean, I just really enjoy the strategy overall.
Yeah, we're gonna have another show coming out within a couple weeks where we're gonna just kind of break down different ways, different different kinds of leagues. We'll talk a little bit about Dynasty, Redraft, just your basic leagues, but then we're going to get into some extreme leagues like Vampire and Guillotine. And Guillotine is where the fab budget really comes into play, and
Yeah.
Jordan will kind of explain that one to you, and he just let everybody know his secret. The next one we got here is Handcuff. It's basically it's an insurance player, typically of the same position. Like 95% of the time, it's the same exact position of a player on the same team that is rostered for injury purposes and stuff like that. So Tony Pollard would be a good handcuff. Alexander Madison would be a better handcuff because Delvin Cook has had an injury history. But guys that could step in and take the place of your starter. Now the downside is obviously they're taking up a draft spot or they're taking up a roster spot on your bench, and you're not typically using them on a normal basis or anything like that. Now, if you're in a multi-flex league where you can play 3, 4, 5 flexes, and I keep on saying that, but I mean Jordan runs a league just like that, so they do exist. But so we are playing guys like Corey Clement was starting in somebody's roster since week 1 last year, and where in other leagues he wouldn't have been on a team unless somebody went down. Yeah, but a handcuff is basically it's a guy that you hold on to. Now you don't necessarily have to just have your own handcuffs either. You could, if somebody else has Delvin Cook, you could go out and get Alexander Madison and kind of just double up on your chances of having two good running backs on your team. If Delvin Cook goes down, you got your guy that you had originally, and then you got Alexander Madison for injury purposes. So it's some people like the handcuff a lot more than others. Some people handcuff way too much, so they'll grab 3 handcuffs from the
Yeah.
same team. So they'll have 6 running backs on their team, and 3 of them they'll be from 3 different teams. It's crazy. I personally am not a huge handcuff guy. The years that I had Le'Veon Bell in my keeper league, I wasn't really keeping the guy that was behind him. I ended up getting James Conner the year that Bell went down. He was a waiver pickup, but I don't really handcuff any of my guys. I don't know if you typically do, but what are your thoughts on the handcuff position there?
I mean, I think overall this is the least exciting way to use the term handcuff, but I guess that's a whole other conversation. But I had to laugh too
Keep it
when you were
PG, all
talking.
right?
That's PG. I didn't say anything. But I had to laugh when you talked about the multiple flexes because I was thinking of that league you're talking about, and I was in the third place game last year, and I played Justin Watson in one of those flex spots. And I mean, that's how deep this league is. What do we play? 5 or 6 flexes, and it's
And a
super
super
flex,
flex, yeah. I
and
think we play like
it's a
three
12 team
starting
league.
running backs too, two or three
Three
starting
running
running
backs,
backs,
3 wide receivers, and I think 5 flexes, and not including the super flex. So that's just 5 running back, wide receiver, tight end
and one little
flexes.
tight end.
So I won the third place game with Justin Watson and one of those flexes, by the way. So I mean, I like playing in those leagues because you really have to dig deep, and a lot of that is about just can you work the waiver wire? Because during bye weeks, the rosters are laughable. I mean, you wouldn't believe some of the guys that get drafted,
Like
but.
it got to the
Uh,
point where David Blau was picked up the week that he was starting. Like I think it was the day that the Sunday that he was starting, David Blau was picked up.
It's not only that he got picked up though, it's that he had I think he got traded for a pretty high round pick, like a 7th or 8th round pick for the next season because people are so desperate just to find anybody in any quarterback that's starting. So that's a whole nother conversation for why super flex leagues are terrible. But going back to handcuffs, I never draft handcuffs. I mean, if you just want to be pretty straightforward about it. And the reason for me is I don't want to draft a guy where the only way he is relevant is if somebody gets injured. I mean, you're just throwing that's like playing roulette for me. I'm not a big roulette player. You're just spinning a wheel and hoping for the best. There's not a ton of strategy for me in that. And of course, you could argue that, you're hedging your bet in case your guy goes down, but I don't like it because if your number one guy plays 16 games that season, then you wasted a draft pick. And
Hmm.
I hate doing that. I hate the thought of doing that. So I'd rather take a guy that's honestly, and this might seem crazy, but I'd rather take a guy that's and this kind of segues into one of the next ones. I didn't even mean to, but a running back by committee guy. So if he's splitting time, at least that guy has an opportunity to take over that backfield at a later ADP. So for me personally, I'd rather take a guy like that over a handcuff. And when I say handcuff, I think of a guy like, I mean, even Alex Madison had some value with the Vikings, and he was getting some touches. I'm thinking of a guy like Reggie Bonifin from the Panthers. I mean, I've seen people draft him in almost every draft I'm in, and I'm like, that's a waste of a draft pick to me because the only way he has any value is if McCaffrey goes down, and even if he goes down, he's going to be way overvalued because he's not McCaffrey. He's not going to replace that production. He's going to be probably not even an RB2, a back end RB2 if you're lucky. So that's the end of my handcuff rant.
And your handcuffs. And if you weren't going to segue, then I was going to go right into running back by committee, which is also abbreviated as RBBC. It's like basically a lot of these teams that drafted running backs this year are probably considered running back by committee. The Bills probably consider running back by committee. The Ravens, the Colts, the not the
49ers.
not the Chiefs anymore. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm sure everybody's heard the news there, but yeah. So I mean, this necessarily isn't a handcuff if you're drafting a J.K. Dobbins or you're drafting a Jonathan Taylor or you're drafting a Zach Moss. These guys, they might not necessarily hold standalone value. It might be a little tough to say, do I want to play Zach Moss this week in my RB2 spot, or do I want to play Kerryon Johnson? It's hard to say, but these are guys where the potential for either the other guys in that backfield, the Dobbins, the Jonathan Taylors, can take over, or they are getting like a 60-40, 50-50, or even a three-way 33-33-33 split of the carries and of the target shares. So in some situations, you want to take those guys. In other situations, you might want to avoid the committees. There more and more teams now are starting to use more committees. It's really your Giants are not, your Panthers are not. Can't even think of who else off the top of my head, but those two definitely. The Titans are not using committee. Even the Saints with Alvin Kamara, they're using a committee there with Latavius Murray. So yeah, I mean,
Jaguars.
Jaguars with not well they brought in Chris Thompson, but last year it was pretty much all Leonard Fournette. So you probably have about maybe a handful of teams that are not using a committee, and then the rest of them are using committee. But it all depends. Like San Francisco has three guys that they might use this year, where the Colts might have three guys where they use this year, and the Ravens have 26 guys that they might use this year, and the Bills have two. So it's What's your thoughts on running back by committee? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit, but anything else that you want to add to it?
I don't think committees are necessarily a bad thing. I think they get a bad rap, but more times than not, well, there's two parts of this. More times than not, somebody does emerge from the backfield. And that might seem crazy to say, but we'll take the Colts for example. Jonathan Taylor is much more talented than Marlon Mack. At some point, talent always wins. I always say that, but I mean that's the truth. So even if it's by week 10, Jonathan Taylor will take over that backfield because he's better than Marlon Mack. So as much as there's a lot of backfields that start off as committees, a lot of them tend to work themselves out as one guy catches fire, one guy's more talented. But the second piece of that is you do have to understand the offensive scheme to a certain extent. The 49ers, for example, I mean, Kyle Shanahan does it, his dad did it, their grandchildren will do it. They just run a running back by committee system. That's the reality of the 49ers offense under Kyle Shanahan. So no matter what happens unless Raheem Mostert is the only running back on that roster because everybody else explodes. That's going to be a running back by committee. So I personally don't mind. I always, if I'm looking at a committee, I like to try to take the more talented guy, even if in the beginning of the year I don't think he's going to be the one. If it's a 60-40 split, but the 40 guy is more talented, I'll lean that way because at some point I think he's probably going to take over that backfield. And realistically, it'll be in the back half of the season when you're trying to win a championship. So I don't necessarily shy away from them. I'm not going to overpay for them because you might only be getting half a quality season out of them. But I think they overall get a bad rap. And in today's game, you kind of have to understand that it's a very fluid term, I guess, because the Bears, for example, do we consider that a running back by committee? I
Mm-mm.
don't really know. I mean, they have two very distinct purposes. David Montgomery is the primary running back. He's their in between the tackles guy. He'll get the goal line carries. But Tariq Cohen's going to have 60 or so receptions. So sometimes these committee backs, they're also on the field at the same time. And that happened a lot with Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb last season, who I think a lot of people at this point would consider that a committee, but Kareem Hunt was lining up all over the field. He was catching balls, and Nick Chubb was their primary running back. So committee backs nowadays, they do play on the field at the same time. So I wouldn't necessarily view it as a negative thing.
Yeah, and I think the Shanahans use committees even when they're playing Madden. That's how committed they are.
Yeah,
Well, hang on a second, I gotta go change out my running back.
it's a
Couple.
5-hour game of Madden.
That's why they added. Because of them specifically, they added the amount of times you could hit pause
Yeah.
online. A couple more. I mean, you've heard of pretty much all the last three that we want to talk about here. A sleeper is kind of the opposite of a bust. It's a player who outperforms his ADP. Last year, the perfect example was Devontae Parker. He was being drafted either real late or in some leagues not even drafted at all, and he ended up as a wide receiver 2, low end wide receiver 1. So that would be a perfect example of a sleeper. Lamar Jackson, same thing. He'd be a perfect example of a sleeper. Even though he had a pretty decent year the year before, he wasn't really being drafted as a QB1, and not even just the overall QB1. He wasn't being drafted as a top 12 a QB1, and he ended up. Obviously, in some leagues, he was kept for. It's hard to really. You can't really say you could get a sleeper in a keeper league because they gain value from being drafted late from their rookie year or stuff like that. But in some leagues, even last year, even in redraft leagues, Lamar Jackson was going late, and he outperformed his ADP by like 3.5 times. So he would be a definition of a sleeper too. Any thoughts on the sleeper term?
Yeah, no, I mean, when I say that I'm targeting value in drafts, essentially you're looking for a guy that's going to outperform his ADP, which is the definition of a sleeper. So, and there's a lot of things that go into determining who a potential sleeper is, and that's a lot of what we talk about in terms of offensive scheme, players that team's acquired, offensive lines, and I always tell people to look forward and not behind because as much as we love to look at data, there are variables that change what's going to happen in the future. So I think that's what you need to look at when you're looking at a sleeper. And I guess on a side note, I my favorite fantasy platform now is Sleeper. So if you don't know what Sleeper is, I always recommend people check it out. I mean, I'm in a ton of Yahoo leagues still, and every time I tell people we should switch it over to Sleeper, and a lot of it too, it's because we do a lot of slow drafts. Almost every draft I do is a slow draft now, and which is I don't know why I didn't think of that 15 years ago when I was banging my head against the wall trying to come up with a time to get everybody together for a draft. But I mean, Sleeper is by far the best for slow drafts. The functionality is great, and one of the nice things I like is they're always improving the app. So, and they listen to the feedback of their users. So, if you haven't used it, I mean, check it out. It's really easy to use, and it's definitely the most friendly for fantasy players.
Well, I have some feedback for him. You should be able to. It should give you an automatic prompt to name your mock draft when you go and start a new mock draft, and not just name it what the previous mock draft was named. I
Lame.
did a mock draft today, and it named it IDP mock draft because that was the last mock draft that I did. Um, and I,
Complain. They'll answer you.
yeah. But that's the cool thing about Sleeper too. I wanted to, while you were talking about that, Sleeper, the app itself allows you to do mock drafts, and you can actually, I mean, you could run your draft right on Sleeper, and it doesn't even have to be for a Sleeper league. If you want to do a Yahoo league or something like that, but you don't want to use their draft setup, or you want to do an offline draft, you can have everybody download the Sleeper app, or even do it on the computer, project it to your screen, and people can manually pick right on their phone. It'll update on the main screen, or you can do it yourself, and you can edit the if, as a commissioner you can put the picks in yourself. But it's definitely like we have a keeper league coming up where it's different rounds that the players are kept in, so it doesn't just count as the top 3 rounds or anything like that. So James Conner would be in the 6th round. I can go in there and preset the board up on Sleeper and put James Conner in the 6th round, and then have my draft already pre-ready to go before everybody gets here. Um, the final term that we want to go over, and then I mean everybody's heard of the word or the term mock draft, so I just wanted to bring it up, but we'll talk about that last. The last actual term that we want to bring up is streaming. Um, it's typically the quarterback, tight end, defensive special teams, kicker position, bye week position, that your guys are on a bye week that you just play favorable matchups. I know you personally, Jordan, have done a lot of mock drafts with you, and we always ask, hey, why didn't you fill out your roster? And you specifically say that you're just going to stream your kicker and your defense week 1. So what does streaming mean? You're going to go into Sunday morning with a blank kicker and defense and find out who the best matchups are for that day, for those games, and then just pick them up right then and there, instead of being tied to the Chicago defense in the 10th round, or the Patriots defense in the 8th round at the draft, or even Houston's defense in the very last round. Why would you tie yourself to Houston's defense instead of grabbing a potential player who could emerge in training camp and wasting that roster spot? So, I mean, streaming, you see it a lot on bye weeks. If you there's no need to, and you'll argue this point, but for me personally, there's no need for me to draft 2 quarterbacks when it comes to bye week, or if I get an injury, I'll just start streaming, or bye week, I'll just start streaming. You like to grab 2 quarterbacks, but you have a different reason for it. That's fine. Tight end, same thing. I don't like to grab 2 tight ends, especially if you're in a league where it only plays 1 tight end, and you're never really going to play a tight end in your flex unless you're grabbing George Kittle and Travis Kelce, or George Kittle and Mark Andrews, or anything like that. So when it comes to Travis Kelce's bye week, then I'll grab a tight end that has a favorable matchup that week.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of strategy in this piece of it. For me, and it goes back to value when you're drafting. I don't always draft 2 tight ends, 2 quarterbacks, but to me it just depends on the value and looking at the board, who's going to provide the most upside for your team. I've actually kind of changed my stance on drafting 2 tight ends and starting a tight end and a flex. I mean, I'm a running back guy, but a lot of these tight ends are they're focal points of the offense now, and you could argue that if you're going to flex a wide receiver, there's some tight ends that are more worthy of that spot than a wide receiver. So I mean, streaming to me is the most strategic part of fantasy. I would say if I had to pick one area of fantasy that I'm the strongest in, it's streaming. And I think typically there's a lot of factors that go into how you pick who you're streaming, and it's more just understanding, and it's different for every position. You don't stream a quarterback the same way you stream a kicker or a defense or a tight end. So you have to do a little bit of research on this, but I think the number one piece of advice I can give people is when you're looking for a favorable matchup, as you alluded to, really what you're looking for is how many fantasy points they tend to give up a game. So I remember last year specifically, the Cardinals gave up the most fantasy points to tight ends last season. And I'm not kidding you, every single time a tight end went up against the Cardinals, they had a huge game every single week.
They
And they had a
averaged
hit.
they averaged a touchdown against per game. Now they didn't get
Yeah,
scored on in 16 straight games, but they let in
it
16
was
touchdowns.
bad. I mean, it was really bad. So, and there's deeper reasons for that. The main reason, and this is why they drafted Isaiah Simmons, is they didn't have any linebackers that could cover tight ends. And Isaiah Simmons, that's one of his big strengths as a linebacker coming into the NFL. So, there's deeper reasons why a lot of times some teams allow more fantasy points to certain positions, but at the end of the day, I think that's the most important piece to consider because we'll say, for example, that they give up the most fantasy points to a quarterback. That doesn't necessarily mean you should stream a running back or a tight end or a defense against that team. You have to look very specific because there's different factors for each position. So Yahoo and Sleeper does it a little bit. I like Yahoo's in-season functionality a lot better than Sleeper. Sleeper, I think, for the draft management and all the preseason and off-season stuff is much better than Yahoo. But I know Yahoo does a really good job of telling you, okay, you have the Rams quarterback and they're going against the Cardinals and they allow the 15th most fantasy points per game. So it's really easy information to find on most apps now, but that's kind of the key to streaming players.
Yeah, quarterbacks and shootout potentials, and
Yeah.
tight ends against the Cardinals, defenses against bad offenses, and so yeah, definitely all that information you just got to look into. But it's
That's what we'll have to do a streaming episode, how to pick how to stream each position.
yeah, I mean that'll be our most talked about episode. And then the final thing, kind of touched on it. We've mentioned it a couple times during this whole segment of this podcast, but it's mock draft. I mean, mock. That's what it is. You just put yourself in different situations, set up different mock drafts. If you only plan on joining 5 leagues and they're all 12-team leagues, then do a couple 12-team mock drafts. If you plan on joining 20 leagues and they vary between 8-team, 12-team, 16-team, dynasty, IDP, then do different mock drafts of different leagues. And the biggest thing that I can say is try to draft from different spots. And then I know you have a nice mock draft piece of advice that you want to share. So I'm gonna let you have that one because that's your baby there. But try to draft from different spots. If you if you you're not guaranteed to get first overall and pick Christian McCaffrey, so maybe pick third overall. Take Zeke, and then see who you get in the second round, and see who you get in the third round. Because obviously, the drop off from picking third overall, you're getting a slightly worse running back, but you're getting a better second round player on the way back. So, what's your advice for mock drafts?
Well, I thought one of the points you were going to bring up too, and I know this drives you nuts as well, but I mean, change your strategy and don't draft the same team every time you do a mock draft. I mean, that completely defeats the purpose of doing a mock draft because you're trying to figure out which strategy works better in different situations. It's just about mocking different situations. And if you're doing the same thing over and over again, you're really not learning anything about how drafts can flow and the strategy that you want to implement during a draft. So, I mean, that's number one. Number two for me, and this is very strange. Every time I say this, people look at me like I'm insane, but I draft players that I don't like in mock drafts.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is I want to see where the players I do like fall. And when you think about it, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. So I love Miles Sanders this year, but I like messing around with where can I get Miles Sanders. If I have a mid first round pick, do I need to reach on Miles Sanders or can I wait on him coming back to me all the way in the second round? Little things like that. Or if I have the eighth pick and I take Joe Mixon, what running backs are coming back to me? Even if Miles Sanders isn't there, or even if he is there, I'll skip over him and see how far he slips in the second round. Because then, even if you're able to trade back in your league, you could realistically maybe skip on taking that player, trade back, still get your guy, and pick up an extra pick. So, there's a lot of strategy when it comes to that, but it's just mess around with your strategy. That's the best advice. I mean, being in leagues for a long time, I can tell you I go very running back heavy, but I mean, you'll see mock drafts where I don't do that just to see how it turns out. And every time I mock draft and take Michael Thomas and Lamar Jackson in the first 2 rounds, I hate my team, and it makes me want to just go jump off a cliff. But I mean, I do it sometimes just to see, okay, what do my running backs look like if I don't take one until the fourth round? The answer is not good. I can tell you that ahead of time. And heading into this season, that's why I'm so adamant in taking multiple running backs in the first 3, 4 rounds. But yeah, I mean, I think the biggest piece of advice is just play around with your strategy.
Yeah, and just kind of understand who you're drafting with, kind of see different tendencies and patterns.
Yep, that's true.
If you're in, obviously, if you join like a random Yahoo league that's paid through Yahoo and you don't know any of these guys, so most of the time the draft is probably going to play out a little closer to how you mock draft. But if I'm in a home league, for example, now my league that I run here is a keeper league, so it's different. My mock draft is going to be different than a normal 12 team mock draft. But if I do a league with a bunch of my buddies here, and Stefan Diggs is consistently going in the fifth, sixth round of mock drafts that I've done, he might not make it to the fifth, sixth round here because that's just how home leagues go. He's drafted a little higher. Devin Singletary might be drafted a little higher. Josh Allen might be drafted a little higher. So kind of keep that stuff in mind too. Like if you live in the Philadelphia area and you want Miles Sanders and you're playing with a bunch of guys from Philadelphia, you probably have to grab him at 1-8, 1-9 because you're not going to get him. I mean, even in the second round, you could probably get him, but the guy at the turn might grab him. So just kind of keep stuff like that in mind too. There's going to be some variables to different mock drafts. Players opting out are definitely going to change things. Like the last mock draft that I did was pre Damian Williams opting out, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire was going down a little later, and now he's creeping his way into the first round. So definitely things are going to change. We are definitely running a little long, but this is a special episode here, so let's keep it going. The next two segments are going to be a little shorter. The first one that we got is we just have some bets going on with a couple guys from our page here, the Fantasy Mafia page. We got a group chat with about, what are we up to, 15, 16 guys now in there?
15, I think, yeah.
So every time, I mean, it's a bunch of dudes just talking different sports. It's not just football, but we're just talking sports in the group chat, and somebody will bring up their opinion on somebody, and somebody else will bring up their opinion on somebody else, and then all of a sudden it's going to turn into, all right, then I bet you that this doesn't happen. So we got a handful of those. We're going to go over we're going to mention what we have. I'm involved in quite a few of them. Jordan, doesn't look like you're involved in any, so I'll just go over what they are, and you kind of just tell me what side you agree with, and we'll just move on. So the first one is our guy Fantasy Caveman. You've seen him on the NBA pods and the Friday Night Lives. He's a Terry McLaurin guy. He's got two different bets here with Terry McLaurin with different people here. I'll just put it under an umbrella and say Zach thinks that he's going to finish in the top 15. Fantasy Caveman thinks he's going to finish in the top 15. Do you think Terry McLaurin could finish in the top 15?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that he could. I like Terry McLaurin coming out of Ohio State personally. I took him in a ton of keeper leagues last year because I've always liked this talent. And, I'll point to his last 3 games. Those were the first 3 games where Dwayne Haskins looked like an NFL quarterback. In his first 6 or so appearances, he looked awful. So Terry McLaurin he averaged over 90 yards his last 3 games. So I definitely think he can do it. Would I necessarily say 100%? No, but I think that's one of the most interesting ones to me. I think for the other ones, I fall pretty squarely on one side or another, but I could see McLaurin finishing at like 16. So I think this is one of the closest ones for me.
So he's got a bet with one of our guys for top 15, then he's got a bet, and this is wide receiver and PPR too. So not 15 overall, but top 15 wide receiver and top 15 wide receiver in PPR. He's got a bet with one of our guys. He's got a bet with Apex for top 15, and then he's got a bet with me for top 20. So there's a chance that he loses the Apex one, but that he beats me. That's kind of where we're at. You're thinking between like 16 to 20 or so.
Yeah.
The next one we have, and actually I already brought up one a little earlier, and and you kind of already answered it, but let's just bring it back up. I think that it's going to be Alex Smith or Kyle Allen starting. You think it's going to be Dwayne Haskins starting? Is that you're on the Haskins side?
Yep.
Okay.
Definitely.
All right. The next one that we got is me. I think that DJ Moore is going to finish top 12 PPR wide receiver.
I mean, call me crazy. I'd probably bet that he's going to be a top 5 wide receiver. And I know that I'm insane for saying that, but I just think that he is the perfect wide receiver for this offense. And I think that he could have a huge season. So I'm definitely on the top 12 bandwagon there.
Perfect. I love it. That's the only one I want to win. I don't have a lot of money invested in these. I just have more. It's like most of mine are
First pride, are you kidding me?
$5 and $10 bets. So they're just it's little ones by the end of the season. Hey, I might win $50 here. Or I might lose $50. Um, I bet that Devontae Parker is a top 20 wide receiver PPR, and that's
Yes,
with
sir.
I think I bet that with Rydog.
Yep.
So you
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Chan Gailey's offense, so if you asked me 2 months ago, I would have said no, but I say yes today.
and we touched on both these players a little earlier. Rydog bets Fantasy Caveman, and these two are always going at it with these two wide receivers. But Rydog bets Fantasy Caveman that Landry outscores Devontae Parker.
Yeah, I mean, I get the Landry argument. If you're looking for more consistency, I'm definitely going with Landry. And I said before that it's not fair because he's never missed a game, but hip injuries actually affect wide receivers pretty significantly because this guy's known as kind of a shifty route runner, and you could start to see that change quite a bit. So even more with him having that problem, I think Parker will outscore Landry.
And then another factor that goes into these is a lot of the player versus player um, bets that we have. There's a injury clause that we throw in there, so
Oh,
13
I gotta
games.
ask you about that.
Yeah. Well, you could ask. Go ahead. Ask me right now.
So, okay, I always try to get people on board with betting this way, and people think I'm crazy, but instead of having an injury clause, why don't people just bet on points per game? Because then it doesn't matter how many games they play. Everybody says that's dumb, but so if he finished, so we'll say DJ Moore, say he only played 12 games, but he averaged the eighth most points. I mean, I'd still say that's successful, so I don't know. That's always been my opinion.
What if it was? What if it was Sammy Watkins last year, week one, and he blows up for 3 touchdowns, and then he gets hurt and he doesn't play the rest of the
I
season?
mean, it can't be one game, I guess, but
Huh?
or can it?
So his average point per game would be 40.
There's not a perfect system, I guess.
Yeah, I mean 13 games I think is pretty good. It's you're obviously eliminating week 17. And then so it's basically they just got to play 13 out of 15 games basically, or yeah, 13 out of 15 games. The next one that we have here is I bet Fantasy Caveman that Teddy Bridgewater finishes higher PPR or not PPR but fantasy points than Daniel Jones.
Is there a difference in PPR versus standard for you?
For quarterbacks, no.
Yes. Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, I mean, I love Daniel Jones, and you can talk about your reasoning, which I think is very valid, but based on Teddy and his just the kind of quarterback he is, I just don't know how fantasy relevant he'll be. He'll have his weeks, and which sounds weird because I love DJ Moore, but just because I love one wide receiver, and you mentioned it earlier, can he provide fantasy relevance for multiple wide receivers? I don't think so. I think he's more of a game manager, a short route kind of guy. So I like Daniel Jones's upside more, and I think your point is completely valid, but I still just love Daniel Jones's upside.
Yeah, Daniel Jones' first half of the schedule is absolutely brutal. I mean, on paper, the worst defenses that he plays are Philly, who really weren't that bad last year, and they added Darius Slay. The Redskins, who added Chase Young, and if there's any bright spot on that team, it is the defense. Sorry, football team. And
Ooh,
I mean, they
that's a
start
swear jar.
they start out the season against Pittsburgh. They got Chicago in there. They might have Dallas in there too, which is also a really improved defense. Their front, when we did our Dallas podcast, I think we mentioned that this defense could finish first in the league for defense. At least their front seven is probably the best front seven that there is. Um, but yeah, I mean Teddy, on top of liking DJ Moore and on top of having the number one running back in fantasy football and real football, they their division is full of shootout game potential just right there. I mean that's 6 games where you might have to throw a lot to keep up with Tom Brady and the Bucks and Drew Brees and the Saints and Matt Ryan and the Falcons. So I think that while the NFC East with Daniel Jones might be a little lower scoring. They might have some shootouts. I mean, we're probably looking at more 35-32 games in the NFC South than we are looking at those scores in the NFC East. Um, I got a bet with Fantasy Caveman that my fantasy teams finish higher than his fantasy teams, but I
Oh,
mean, we
that's an
really
easy
can't.
one.
That's easy pickings for me. Um, and then Apex bet Fantasy Caveman that Clyde Edwards-Helaire finishes higher than Joe Mixon, and this was post Damian Williams news.
Yeah, I mean that one's tough. I just think in general we've seen rookie running backs have success, but I'd still take Joe Mixon in that one. I mean, this is a guy that's already proven, and I think that he has even more potential than he had last year. And I think he finished as RB 13 or 14 off the top of my head, and that was with really no quarterback and a an offensive line that was terrible. So I think he's a pretty surefire top 10 guy this year, and Edwards-Helaire as a rookie could be, but I'm just not certain.
All right, so there's going to be plenty more. That's just what we're at to right now. Fantasy Caveman is going to be handing over pretty much a whole month's worth of paychecks. It looks like. Um,
Yeah.
it's, but yeah, I mean, there's like I said, it's just a bunch of alpha guys in a group chat that are just always saying stuff, and somebody is uh is gonna think that their guy is better than another guy, and they're gonna throw a bet out there, and that's just how it goes. And um, I mean, I know you want to get in on some of this action too, and you probably will. I got a bunch of guys that I'm very high on that other people might not be, so I'll start throwing some names out there and see if anybody catches. But yeah, well, it is definitely going to be fun.
I can tell you my problem with the bets is that usually when I have an opinion on a guy, I'm pretty convincing with my argument, and then everybody agrees with me. So no one wants to bet against. I mean, I'm not like saying that as a pat on my back. I tend to come up with pretty convincing arguments when I really like a guy. So I keep trying to get people to bet on Miles Sanders, but nobody will take anything on Miles Sanders now. So I'm disappointed. I like to let my play in the league speak, I guess.
I'll think of a Miles Sanders bet. We'll get something going.
Okay.
The final segment that we want to talk about here is the player opt outs, and like I said, by the time this podcast posts, it's going to be it'll be earlier in the day on Thursday, but the deadline day is today. It would be Thursday for players to opt out. 4 p.m. Eastern time, I believe, is when the NFL said that the deadline day was. So since it opened up and since they started to figure out what the plan was, they've had a few people slowly but surely start opting out. I think the earliest one was the offensive guard for the Kansas City Chiefs, Duvernay Tardif. Starting offensive guard. It's not like he was a backup or a bum or anything like that. So he was one of the first ones to go out. I don't know the exact order. I just got in the list in front of me as I got all the teams basically, and they are in alphabetical order. And then just some bigger names started to roll in. You got the Patriots had about half their roster already opt out. We'll probably talk about a couple of those names, but right now we're just going to talk about potential fantasy relevant players. And the biggest name on the list, and we've already talked about it a couple times, is Damian Williams. So we already know what that's going to do to the Chiefs. But what does that do for Clyde Edwards-Helaire in your rankings? What does that do for Damian Williams' future, basically either on this team or in the NFL? And what are your thoughts on that? Because this was a team that was bringing back 11 offensive starters from last year, and now they're bringing back 9 offensive starters from last year because 2 of them opted out.
Yeah, now they stink. But yeah, I mean that's really the only one at this point, and I'd expect something else to come out. But I mean, we were debating just a few weeks ago how this backfield was going to play out. I think a lot of us weren't really confident in Allaire going into the season just because Dame Williams, and I said that I don't have a lot of faith in Damian Williams. If they had so much faith in him as an organization, they wouldn't have gone out and taken a running back in the first round. But I mean, for me, Dame Williams was still going to be involved in that offense in some capacity, whether it was only 8 carries a game. That's still 8 carries that he was taking away from Clyde Edwards. So to me, a lot of people are reading into still Andy Reid calling him Brian Westbrook. I do think he has that ability. I think if he's heavily involved in the pass game, that he can be a top 10 running back, but we're just going to have to see how they use him, because you've mentioned this before, so I won't necessarily take this point, but I don't know if Mahomes' gunslinging style necessarily fits in with Allaire, and he's not going to get a lot of dump-off passes is the reality of this situation. But if they specifically design plays and run a scheme that is directly through Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So when Brian Westbrook was with the Eagles, they used to run a ton of running back screens and running back option routes, and Westbrook wasn't the kind of guy you just dumped it off to him when you were under pressure. I mean, they designed this offense around Brian Westbrook. If they do that with Helaire, this is a guy that can be a top 10 guy. I think that I'm not as confident as other people in him. I think that he has the upside. I love him, but I'm not 100% in saying that, oh, he's going to be an RB1 this year. He's still a rookie. There's still a lot of question marks, even though they're going to have some sort of training camp. It's not going to be a full program. And I just think it may take a few weeks for him to get into the groove. I mean, there's not a lot of competition there. I guess that's one positive for him.
Mm-hmm.
The only 2 running backs they really have right now are DeAndre Washington, who was with the Raiders last season, and they also have Darrell Williams, who is the only Chiefs running back right now on the roster that was on the team last season. So he's the only one as of right now that knows that playbook. So I don't know if that's going to be a factor at all. If Darrell, not Dare. I keep wanting to give him a different name, but this is Darrell Williams, and I don't know if he's going to be involved. But Helaire has that upside, but I'll say I'm not overly sold on taking him in the second round still. He's still going to go through those rookie struggles, and as much as I think he'll be the guy, we'll just have to see how they use him.
Well, if there's any consolation, Darrell Williams can change his name or change his number to 26 and not have to change his jersey. A couple other, I mean, so that was the biggest name, obviously, and you kind of answered a question that I was going to ask you. I was going to say, if your commissioner says, "Hey, we're drafting right now," where are you taking Damian Williams? 12-team PPR. Are you touching them? Are you taking them? Where are you taking them?
Damian Williams, where do I take
Oh no,
him?
Clyde Edwards-Helaire.
I'm not taking Damian Williams at all, and I think that's a sound draft strategy right now. But so for me personally, and I always say and the way that I draft, which sounds stupid to say out loud, but that's the reality. I mean, I would take him as my 3rd running back in the 3rd round, and I usually draft 3 running backs in the first 3 rounds, so I would be a lot more comfortable in that spot. So if I had, we'll say, the first overall pick, and I took McCaffrey, and then all the way back I got Austin Eckler, who I've seen in that spot a few times, and then I took Helaire also on the turn there, I would be more confident in that. So all of a sudden, if he doesn't perform as an RB1, I mean, he's my flex at that point. So I think that kind of limits the risk of drafting him. So I'm more comfortable, I'd say, in the mid-3rd is where I'd start to really consider him. I'd rather take Eckler and Sanders and Jacobs and Drake and all those guys before him. I think I had him as my RB15 right now, so more in that range.
Yeah, and I think he, even before the Damian Williams news, when we did our running back rankings podcast, I think he came in at 15 overall anyways.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure he's moved up then because a couple people moved him up, but yeah, that's a fair assessment for him. So the only other players here on this list that are, I mean, they're not even fantasy relevant, but they play on the offensive side of the ball. A couple of wide receivers in the NFC North that are first year for this team, so now they're gonna have to wait to make their debuts. We got Devin Funches for the Packers and Geronimo Allison for the Lions. Devin Funches, he's going to be my sleeper for a 3rd year in a row because last year it didn't work out, and this year obviously it didn't work out, so I'm going to choose him next year. As long as I keep calling him a sleeper, I guess don't draft him because he's not going to do anything. Geronimo Allison, he was signed this offseason. He kind of plays the same kind of position as Danny Amendola does there in Detroit, so it was probably going to come down to one of these two not making the roster, and I guess that just made coaching decisions pretty easy with Allison opting out, and we'll probably see him next year. The Patriots, as we mentioned, had a few opt out. The biggest ones are Brandon Bolden, which really isn't that big. They still have Sonny Michelle, and they still have Damian Harris. So I mean, we've in Patriots offenses of the past, we've seen the sixth string running back come in and get a couple carries and get into the end zone, but it's not that's not a huge loss there. Marquise Lee, who was brought in from Jacksonville, he had actually had potential to not only make the roster but maybe be one of the top three wide receivers there. He decided to opt out, and Matt Lacoste, who was the one of their tight ends from last year, opted out too. Any Nothing major there, but any thoughts on any of those three guys?
Well, let's talk about Devin Funchess. Let's do
No, I
that.
don't want to.
The only time, I mean, Devin Funchess is always a sleeper because that's what he does on the field because he's terrible. But he, no, I mean, I really don't like Devin Funchess. I didn't think he was going to be the number two in Green Bay. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is one of those guys, and he said this before. He trusts certain wide receivers, and he targets those guys. I mean, I remember it with. I mean, he's done it with several wide receivers now, so I don't think that Devin Funchess was going to be reliable enough for him to rely on. Devin Funchess has led the league in drops or been towards the top every season in the league, so I don't think he's that good. So I wasn't really targeting him. I don't know who the second wide receiver is, so don't ask me because your guess is as good as mine. I mean, he said last season that he trusted Alan Lazard, so I don't know how much you want to read into that, but if I had to pick a guy, a wide receiver, I would probably pick Alan Lazard. Matt Lacoste is kind of under the radar. He was probably going to start for the Patriots, and I don't think he was going to be fantasy relevant, but they did draft two rookie tight ends this year, and that'll give them an opportunity to shine. And we know how much Josh McDaniels has liked using two tight end sets. So Devin Asiasi and Dalton Keene there. I'm not saying draft them in redraft leagues, but I'm keeping an eye out on them. I have them in taxi squads in several leagues, actually, because I like them in that offense. But it'll be interesting. Rookie tight ends are very rarely successful, but they may have an opportunity year one to show something.
And then two more names, one final offensive player, and then another name I want to bring up, and then we'll close it out. But Marquise Goodwin, he was also one of the earliest ones. He was brought over from the 49ers to the Eagles, kind of in that same room as, well, Alshon Jeffrey is probably starting on the pup. They got Deshaun Jackson, Jalen Rieger. So three guys that were kind of the same kind of wide receiver. So Marquise Goodwin, he was probably one of those guys that even though they did trade for him, he was probably fighting for a job there too with a lot of similar wide receivers. Now, as much as Philly could use wide receivers, so they're not using Walmart cashiers, it was going to be tough for him to make the roster. So he opted out. And then, well, what's your thoughts on that? And then I'll go into the last guy, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that wide receiver room is kind of confusing. I don't really know who the main target there's going to be. I know you love your Carson Wentz stat there, so the wide receiving core can't be much worse this season. I'm kind of interested to see who runs those short to intermediate routes, especially even with Goodwin there. I mean, between Rieger, Goodwin, and Deshaun Jackson, those guys are all burners. So, I mean, I like Alshon Jeffrey if he's healthy, actually, because I think he's the only one that can run a short route right now. Maybe Jalen Rieger is going to surprise us, but that whole wide receiver core, I'm just staying away from.
And then the last one is surprising news. The entire New York Jets team decided to opt out. So they're only going to play this year with
No loss to the league.
they're only going to play this year with 31 teams. But no, C.J. Mosley, who missed all of last year with an injury, after being signed to a pretty fair-sized contract by the Jets from the Baltimore Ravens, is now year two with the Jets, and he's not playing again. So, I mean, that's in IDP leagues, that's a big loss there potentially. That's also it for the Jets. It's a big loss. Come in a couple days after they lost Jamal Adams via trade. I mean, this whole team is just falling apart. But now they're down to. I mean, the highest profile name player right now on that team is probably Le'Veon Bell, but the best player on the team is I don't even know. But what are your thoughts on Mosley for IDP leagues and just the Jets overall?
Yeah, I mean the Jets overall, they should probably have the first overall pick next season, and they'll have an interesting dilemma to decide if they want to go with Trevor Lawrence or if they want to trade down, or what are they going to do with Sam Darnold, who has shown potential, but he's with Adam Gase, so what do you do with that? But CJ Mosley for me was a nice bounce back candidate for IDP leagues, and I remember you and I mentioning him in our Jets mini series episode. He's been very successful when he's on the field. He hadn't missed very many games before last season, but I liked him as a bounce back guy to be a very effective IDP. So definitely the best player left on the Jets defense, and I mean it could be really bad for him this season. I mean, I don't. I mean, they still. It's crazy to me they won 7 games last season. That blows my mind that happened, and I have no idea how that happened. But this is a team that should only win like 3 games, I would say.
I mean, just a week ago we were talking about how the Jets defense could be a sleeper defense even just in fantasy. Now they definitely have some unfavorable matchups. They got the Chiefs this year. They got the Broncos this year. So maybe you weren't starting them there, but they on paper they had some favorable matchups, and now I mean they don't. They like I wouldn't even start them against the Dolphins or they don't play the Redskins, but I wouldn't start them against the Redskins now. But it's going to be ugly down there in New York, and I mean Sam Darnold, he's still trying to play for a contract. Both him and Josh Allen are going to be, and Lamar Jackson, all coming from that same draft class, are going to be getting some contracts soon. So I mean, is the first coach that's going to be gone this year is probably going to be Adam Gase. There's probably no doubt about that. And then hopefully for the Jets' sake, they turn it around. Hopefully, I mean, I don't care if they do or not because they're in my division. But
Yes, they do.
for the Jets' sake, hopefully they turn it around. And yeah, I mean, that's all we got for today's episode. We're already at an hour and 46, so we might as well just push it out a little further. Let's do some plug-in now. Make sure you guys check out our website. That's www.thefantasymafia.com. On there, you'll find our rankings. You'll find our player articles. You'll find other stuff that we do on there. That's pretty much it.
Lots of stuff.
Lots of stuff with lots of things. So thefantasymafia.com. Check out our Facebook pages that we got. The main page is the Fantasy Mafia. The sister page that we got is Fantasy Hotspot. The Fantasy Mafia is the source of all of our articles, all of our rankings, all of our podcasts. That's where it goes there first, and then it filters out to different places. And one of those places is the Fantasy Hotspot. What the Fantasy Hotspot is that's our it's like our forum, and that's where people could go in there and they could start their own topics. We've seen a lot of people come in and start dropping their drafts that they've done. People are getting into doing drafts, which I still think is a little early, but to each their own. Posting pictures of their drafts and asking how they did, where they can improve their roster, posting the whole draft board and asking who had the better draft. We got our Razzes going on in there. We just gave away a Frank Gore Miami Hurricanes jersey, which was, of all the jerseys that we've had, I think that was probably the best looking one that I've seen that we've done so far. We got a mystery box every Monday, mystery box Monday that we do. So typically they range anywhere between $10 to $15 a spot. So definitely check that out. Check out our Twitter. Well, Dr. Fantasy Holic's Twitter. It's Dr. Fantasy Holic. Sorry about the name, but that's what it is. Probably going to change soon, but go subscribe now while it's easy to remember. And then anything else you want to touch on?
No, that was a work of art, and I appreciate everybody who listens. And I think the most important piece is to just go on the hot spot, start some conversation, and that forum is for you guys. And I've really enjoyed the past week or so. A few people have posted their rosters, saying, what do I need to improve? Can you think of any trades that I may be able to target? So, I love that conversation. So make sure you guys post anything that's on your mind. We have a ton of sports going on right now, so it doesn't have to just be football. We have guys that follow hockey, the NBA, MLB. So whatever sports news is on your mind, go in there and type it out, and let's discuss it with a bunch of other sports fanatics.
All right. So with that being said, next week we will start our wide receiver rankings. We're going to break them down probably into 2 or 3 different episodes. Still debating that, and then yeah, we're going to be one step closer to the NFL season.